Chapter 13, Unraveling at the Seams. Chief Maria Rodriguez had been a cop for 20 years. She'd worked homicide in Boston, seen bodies in every state of decomposition, interviewed killers who'd done things that still haunted her nightmares, and investigated crimes that tested her faith in humanity. When she took the job as police chief in Millbrook, Vermont, she'd thought she was trading complexity for peace, chaos for quiet, the impossible for the mundane. She was wrong. Ian Martin sat in the back of her patrol car, zip-tied wrists resting on his lap, and he wouldn't stop talking. At first, Rodriguez thought it was the standard post-arrest rambling, shock, denial, bargaining. But as she listened, really listened, she realized this was something else entirely. "They were dead," Ian said, his voice alternating between hysterical laughter and something close to sobbing. His hands trembled. "I made sure they were dead. I checked pulses. I waited. I confirmed. They were dead, Maria. They were all dead." His voice cracked on the last word, and he started laughing again, that horrible broken sound that made Rodriguez's skin crawl. She'd heard killers laugh before, but this was different. This was the laughter of a mind coming apart at the seams. Rodriguez's dashboard camera captured every word. She'd activated it the moment Ian started confessing at the farmhouse, and she hadn't turned it off. This was evidence. This was a prosecutor's dream. A full, detailed confession delivered without coercion, without Miranda violations. Just a man whose mind had shattered under the weight of impossible events. She could already see the courtroom, hear the gasps from the jury as they listened to this recording. "But they came back," Ian continued, his reflection in her rear-view mirror showing wild eyes and a face that had aged 10 years in the past week. "All of them came back. I saw Eleanor Henderson yesterday. Walked right past her in the grocery store like she hadn't drowned 3 months ago. She smiled at me, Maria. She smiled." "You're saying you attempted to murder Eleanor Henderson?" Rodriguez kept her voice neutral, professional. "Let him talk. Let the camera record." "Not attempted. Did. I murdered her. I murdered all 7 of them. I planned it carefully. Methods that would look natural. Times when they'd be alone. Ways to avoid suspicion. I was good at it, Maria. Really good." The pride in his voice made Rodriguez's stomach turn. "But the doctor brought them back. Connor McMasters. He's not natural. He's something else. A necromancer. A witch. I don't know what to call it. He found my victims and he resurrected them. And now they're all at his farmhouse, all 7 of them, staring at me with their dead eyes." Rodriguez pulled into the police station parking lot, but didn't turn off the car. "Tell me about each one, Ian, starting with Eleanor Henderson." And he did. For 47 minutes, Ian Martin provided a detailed confession to 7 murders, victims, methods, motives, timing. He described Eleanor's terror as she realized what was happening in that bathtub. He explained how he'd researched the exact pressure points to collapse Thomas Grayson's windpipe. He detailed the specific blend of antifreeze in sweet tea that killed Margaret Chen. Each murder was described with clinical precision, the kind of detail that came only from actually committing the crime. It should have been the easiest prosecution in Millbrook's history. Except for one problem that defied explanation. All 9 victims were standing in Connor McMaster's living room, very much alive. Rodriguez left Ian in a holding cell, still ranting about resurrection and necromancy, and returned to Connor's farmhouse with 2 officers and a sense of dread she couldn't quite explain. The scene was surreal. 9 people who should be dead, who were dead according to death certificates and coroner's reports, standing in a farmhouse living room, drinking coffee and looking remarkably alive for corpses. She took statements from each supposed victim, recording them carefully, knowing even as she did that these stories wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. But she recorded them anyway, because this was her job, and because some part of her wanted documentation of the impossible. Eleanor Henderson, 78, former principal. "I must have been in some kind of coma when Mr. Martin attacked me. My condition mimicked death closely enough to fool the EMTs. But Dr. McMasters recognized the signs of life. He revived me and kept me at his guest house while I recovered. He thought it was safer not to reveal I was alive until the investigation concluded." Rodriguez wrote it down, her pen pressing hard enough to almost tear through the paper. She didn't believe a word of it. She'd been at the scene when Eleanor's body was discovered. She'd watched the EMTs work on her, seen them call it after 20 minutes of futile effort. She had the coroner's report on her desk. Eleanor Henderson had been autopsied. Her death certificate was signed by Dr. Patricia Okonkwo. the county medical examiner who'd performed hundreds of autopsies over 20 years. The body had been cremated. Rodriguez had spoken to the funeral director personally. And yet, here stood Eleanor Henderson, breathing, speaking, sipping coffee like she was at a pleasant social gathering. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. Flesh and blood, and very much alive. Very much not cremated. Thomas Grayson, 65, retired military. The strangulation didn't kill me. Damaged my windpipe severely. Yes, but not fatally. I was hospitalised under a false name while recovering. Dr. McMasters thought it was safer to keep me hidden until he understood what was happening with the other victims. Rodriguez studied the faint bruising still visible on Thomas's neck, purple and yellow marks that stood out against his weathered skin. Bruising that should have faded months ago if he'd actually survived the initial attack. Bruising that looked suspiciously fresh for an old injury. She'd seen strangulation victims before, too many of them. She knew what those marks looked like weeks later, months later. This wasn't right. More than that, she remembered Thomas's case specifically. The call had come in from a neighbour who'd heard sounds of struggle. By the time officers arrived, Thomas was already gone. No pulse, no respiration, fixed and dilated pupils. The EMTs had worked on him for 30 minutes anyway, because he was a veteran and a good man, and nobody wanted to give up. But dead was dead, and Thomas Grayson had been dead. She'd attended his memorial service at the VFW Hall. She'd presented his sister with a flag and thanked her for her brother's service. She'd stood with her officers as they saluted his coffin. And now, Thomas Grayson sat in front of her, very much alive, claiming it had all been a medical misdiagnosis. Margaret Chen, 73. The hospital staff misdiagnosed my condition. I wasn't dead, just in a deep coma from the poisoning. Dr. McMaster's quick intervention with the correct antidote saved me, but I needed months of recovery. David Ortiz, 70, restaurant owner. I wasn't home when the fire happened. I'd stepped out to purchase supplies for the restaurant. When I came back and saw the fire, I panicked. Everyone assumed I died in the blaze, and I was too traumatized to correct them immediately. Dr. McMasters found me and convinced me to stay hidden while he investigated. Rebecca Walsh, 68, church volunteer. The fall looked worse than it was. I broke several bones but didn't die. Dr. McMasters arranged private care rather than hospitalization, where my presence might have alerted the murderer. Harold Pemberton, 74. I don't remember much. Trauma-induced amnesia. But I'm alive. That's what matters. Rodriguez interviewed all 6, and each story followed the same pattern. Near death, survival through medical intervention, or fortunate circumstance, recovery in secret. Each story was also thoroughly implausible. These weren't survivor stories. These were cover stories, carefully coordinated, but fundamentally impossible. Jennifer Wu stood slightly apart from the others, and her story was even more problematic. There was something different about Jennifer, something Rodriguez couldn't quite identify. Attention, maybe? Or awareness that the others didn't quite have. Like Jennifer understood exactly how impossible this all was, and was waiting to see if Rodriguez would call them on it. I managed to escape the car before it fully submerged, Jennifer said, her voice steady and rehearsed. The impact knocked me unconscious, but I came to underwater and swam out through the broken window. I made it to shore, downstream, where Dr. McMasters found me and brought me here to recover. Rodriguez had been at the scene when they'd pulled Jennifer Wu's car from the river. She'd been there for hours, supervising the recovery, coordinating with the dive team. She'd watched as they winched the sedan up from 30 feet of water. She'd seen the EMT report of Jennifer being rescued, but not surviving, dead. And yet, here stood Jennifer Wu, dry and alive, and offering her a cup of coffee. Not a ghost, not a twin, not a case of mistaken identity. The same woman, the same fingerprints, when Rodriguez had quietly checked them during the interview. The same dental records when she'd made a discreet call to Jennifer's dentist. Jennifer Wu had been dead. Jennifer Wu was alive. Both things were true, and they couldn't both be true. And Rodriguez's rational mind was starting to fracture under the strain of holding both impossibilities simultaneously. Connor McMasters stood in the doorway, watching the interviews with that calm, unreadable expression he always wore. Rodriguez had known Connor for 15 years, ever since he'd moved to Millbrook. He was a good doctor. Excellent, really. He'd saved lives, treated patients others had given up on, seemed to have an almost supernatural instinct for diagnosis. The town loved him. Rodriguez had always thought there was something slightly off about him in ways she couldn't quite pinpoint. Too knowledgeable, too calm around death, too perfect at his job, too practiced in his movements, like someone who'd done everything 1,000 times before. And now this. 7 resurrections, all connected to Connor McMasters. After the interviews concluded and her officers finished photographing the scene? What scene? Rodriguez thought. 8 people drinking coffee in a living room. Connor pulled her aside. Maria, I know this seems strange. Strange? Rodriguez interrupted, keeping her voice low enough that her officers couldn't hear. Connor, this is insane. You're telling me 7 people survived what Martin describes as successful murders? That they were all hiding at your farmhouse during the investigation? That multiple coroners and medical examiners misdiagnosed them as dead? Connor met her eyes steadily. Those eyes had always been odd, she realized now. Not their color, a perfectly normal hazel, but their quality. Eyes that had seen too much, known too much. Eyes that didn't match his apparent age of 40-something. What I'm telling you, Connor said carefully, is that Ian Martin attempted to murder 7 people, believed he succeeded, and has now confessed to those murders in detail. Whether he actually succeeded or merely believed he did doesn't change his guilt. The intent was there. The actions were there. And 7 people are alive today who wouldn't be if not for intervention. Maria studied him. This town doctor who was suddenly at the centre of an inexplicable situation. Off the record, Connor. What really happened here? Connor considered his answer for a long moment. Rodriguez could almost see him weighing options, calculating risks, deciding how much truth to reveal. On the record, he said finally, everything they told you is true, as far as any investigation will be able to prove otherwise. Off the record, sometimes people get second chances in ways that don't fit neatly into official reports. Ian Martin is a serial killer who believed he succeeded 9 times. These people are alive because they received help when they needed it most. Does the exact mechanism of their survival matter more than the fact that they're alive? Maria Rodriguez wanted to argue, to demand answers, to understand. But she was also a practical woman who recognized when pushing for truth might undermine justice. Ian Martin had confessed to 7 murders. 7 people he'd tried to kill were standing alive in this farmhouse. That was a win, even if the details made her head hurt. I'm going to have questions, Rodriguez said finally. A lot of questions, and some of these statements aren't going to hold up under serious scrutiny. Defense attorneys are going to tear these stories apart. Martin's confession will hold up, Connor countered. His planning documents, his internet search history, his financial motive. You'll find all of that when you search his home and office. It all supports the charges. The defense might argue that the victim's survival means he's not guilty of murder, but attempted murder, conspiracy, assault with intent to kill. You have him cold on all of that. Rodriguez nodded slowly, thinking it through. He's ranting about zombies and resurrection. His lawyer will argue insanity. Then he'll spend his life in psychiatric care instead of prison. Either way, he won't hurt anyone else. As Chief Rodriguez returned to her patrol car, she looked back at Connor's farmhouse. 6 people who'd been declared dead, and 1, a miracle survivor, were standing together on the porch, watching the police vehicles pull away. There was something deeply wrong about all of this, something Rodriguez's instincts were screaming at her to investigate. But there was also something right about it. A killer caught, victims safe, justice served, even if the path to it was impossible. Chief Rodriguez started her car and drove toward the station. She'd write her report carefully, focus on the confession and evidence, soft pedal the impossible parts. Sometimes being a good cop meant knowing when to stop asking questions. Behind her, at Connor's farmhouse, the resurrected patients slowly released breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. The first hurdle was cleared. While Chief Maria Rodriguez processed Ian at the station, the fingerprints, photographs, formal charges, 2 officers executed search warrants on Ian's condo and office. What they found exceeded even the wildest prosecutorial fantasies. Ian's condo was a disaster area that told the story of a man's complete psychological collapse. Empty liquor bottles lined the kitchen counter. 17 bottles of scotch in various stages of emptiness, representing weeks of heavy drinking. The cheap stuff too, Rodriguez noted. Ian Martin had been a successful real estate agent, drove a BMW, wore expensive suits. But these bottles were bottom-shelf scotch, the kind desperate people bought when money got tight and morals got looser. Pizza boxes and take-out containers suggested Ian hadn't cooked a meal in months. Dishes piled in the sink showed a man who'd stopped caring about basic hygiene. The bedroom was worse. Unmade bed, clothes strewn everywhere, prescription pill bottles on the nightstand, Ambien, Xanax, antidepressants, all prescribed within the last 6 months, all from different doctors. Doctor shopping, another sign of someone spiralling. But it was the walls that really told the story. The walls that made Officer Danny Martinez stop dead in his tracks and immediately call Chief Rodriguez. Ian had created what the officers would later describe in their report as a murder map. A large street map of Millbrook tacked to his living room wall with coloured pins marking properties, photos of his victims attached with red yarn connecting them to their holdings, handwritten notes documenting their routines and vulnerabilities. It looked like something from a crime thriller, except it was real, horrifyingly, meticulously real. Eleanor Henderson's photo, refuses to sell, alone every Tuesday, terrified of bathtubs, use that. Thomas Grayson's photo, military, strong but predictable, poker night VFW every Thursday, back door unlocked after 10 p.m. Margaret Chen's photo, too trusting, antifreeze tasteless in sweet tea, she drinks 2 glasses every afternoon. The notes went on, detailing each victim with clinical precision that would make prosecutors weep with joy. Ian had documented his own crimes with the thoroughness of someone who never believed he'd be caught, someone who thought himself too clever for consequences. Officers also found Ian's laptop, left open to a spreadsheet titled Property Acquisition Timeline. Each victim's property was listed with estimated value, potential resale price, and projected profit margin. Next to each entry, completed or in progress. The internet search history was even more damning. How long until drowning victim dies? Can strangulation be detected post-mortem? Antifreeze poisoning symptoms timeline. How to stage accidental death. Ian had been thorough in his research, methodical in his planning. His office at Martin & Associates Real Estate yielded even more evidence. Files for each victim showed Ian had been the listing agent for neighbouring properties, had approached each victim multiple times with purchase offers, had been rebuffed repeatedly. His financial records showed mounting debts, bad investments, gambling losses, a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The motive was clear. Desperate man kills elderly property owners, inherits or purchases properties cheap, sells at market value to cover debts. The evidence was overwhelming, more than enough for multiple life sentences, except Ian Martin was claiming the victims weren't actually dead, that a necromancer had resurrected them, that nothing about this case was real or natural or comprehensible. Chief Rodriguez spent Monday morning reviewing the evidence, building her case, and trying not to think too hard about the impossibilities. The confession was solid. The evidence was overwhelming. 7 people were alive. Ian Martin belonged in prison or a psychiatric facility. But Maria was a detective at heart, and good detectives couldn't leave mysteries unsolved. Monday afternoon, after ensuring Ian was properly processed and his lawyer had been contacted, after writing up her preliminary reports and fielding calls from the district attorney, who couldn't believe how easy this case was going to be, she did something she knew she'd probably regret. She started a file on Connor McMasters. Not an official investigation file. She was smarter than that. This was personal, kept on her home computer, a collection of observations and questions that had no place in official reports. Just a cop's instincts telling her something was wrong, something was impossible, something needed understanding, even if it could never be prosecuted. Connor McMasters had moved to Millbrook 15 years ago from Boston. His credentials were impeccable. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins, residency at Massachusetts General, various certifications and specializations. His references all checked out. His background check was clean. On paper, Connor McMasters was a model citizen and excellent physician. But Rodriguez hadn't become a detective by trusting paper. She started with the basics. Connor's financial history only went back 30 years. Before that, nothing. No credit cards, no bank accounts, no tax returns. It wasn't impossible. People could live off the grid, especially before everything went digital. But it was unusual for a doctor, for someone with a medical degree and legitimate credentials. His medical license was current, but when Rodriguez called Johns Hopkins to verify his degree, they had trouble locating his records. Our system had a data migration issue in the 90s, the registrar explained, sounding annoyed. Some older records are difficult to access, but I can confirm we have a Connor McMasters who graduated in 1995. Is there a problem? Rodriguez had said no, thanked her, hung up. 1995. That would make Connor about 50 now, assuming he'd gone to medical school in his mid-20s. But Connor didn't look 50. Connor looked 35, maybe 40 on a bad day. Good genes, Rodriguez told herself. Some people aged well. Connor's age was listed as 45. But Rodriguez had a good eye for ages, came with the job. And Connor looked younger, moved younger, spoke with the vocabulary and cadence of someone much older, but the face of someone in their 30s. She found Connor's previous addresses, traced his movements. Boston for 10 years, before that San Francisco for 8 years. Always staying just long enough to establish a practice and reputation, then moving on. Never marrying, never putting down real roots, never leaving much trace beyond professional achievements. Rodriguez stared at her computer screen, at the patterns emerging in Connor McMaster's too perfect life, and felt the weight of knowledge she didn't want. 7 people had died. She had death certificates, coroner's reports, cremation records. Those weren't mistakes or bureaucratic errors. Those people had been dead. 7 people were now alive, telling implausible cover stories, claiming medical miracles and fortunate circumstances. One doctor connected to all of them, with a background that looked perfect until you looked too closely, who'd convinced 7 survivors to hide at his farmhouse during a murder investigation. The evidence pointed to something impossible, something Rodriguez's rational, practical mind rejected automatically. But Rodriguez had learned over 20 years of police work that sometimes the impossible was just the truth, wearing an uncomfortable face. She spent 2 hours writing everything down. Observations, questions, suspicions, the kind of detective work that had made her reputation in Boston. She documented every inconsistency in Connor's background, every implausibility in the victims' stories, every piece of evidence that suggested something supernatural at work. She built a case the way she'd built hundreds of cases before, following evidence to its logical conclusion, even when that conclusion defied reason. People had died. Real deaths verified by medical professionals, documented with death certificates and autopsy reports and cremation records. Rodriguez had copies of all of it in her files, official documents that couldn't be dismissed as bureaucratic errors. Those people were now alive, telling cover stories that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of serious investigation, claiming medical miracles that violated every known law of biology. One doctor connected to all of them, with a background that looked perfect until you looked too closely, with credentials that were real but somehow felt false, with an age that didn't match his face, and a knowledge that seemed too deep for someone who'd only been practicing medicine for 20 years. The evidence pointed to something impossible, something Rodriguez's rational, practical, 20-year cop mind rejected automatically, because accepting it meant rewriting everything she understood about the world. But Rodriguez had learned over 2 decades of police work that sometimes the impossible was just the truth, wearing an uncomfortable face. She'd seen things that shouldn't happen, coincidences too perfect to be random, crimes that solved themselves in ways that defied probability, moments when the universe seemed to bend itself around certain people in ways she couldn't explain. She stared at her computer screen, at the patterns emerging in Connor McMaster's too perfect life, at the impossible story of 9 resurrections, and felt the weight of knowledge she didn't want. This was the kind of knowledge that changed you, that made you question everything, that meant you could never look at the world the same way again. Rodriguez had a choice. She could keep investigating, follow this thread to whatever impossible conclusion waited at the end, potentially unravel Connor's entire existence and force questions about the nature of life and death that nobody was equipped to answer. Or she could let it go. Close the file. Move on. Accept that Ian Martin was a killer, that 7 people were alive, and that the mechanism connecting those 2 facts was something she didn't need to understand. Rodriguez deleted the file from her computer, ran a secure wipe program to ensure it couldn't be recovered, shredded her paper notes, and went back to building an airtight case against Ian Martin. Some secrets were worth keeping. Some questions were better left unasked. Sunday evening, Connor's farmhouse. The sun had set an hour ago, painting the Vermont sky in shades of purple and gold before surrendering to darkness. Inside, the living room glowed with warm lamplight, and 9 resurrected people gathered around Connor's coffee table for what they all knew would be their last meeting as a group. The energy was different now. During their weeks together, they'd formed a strange family, bonded by trauma and impossible circumstances. They'd shared meals, swapped stories, held each other through nightmares and panic attacks. They'd become the only people in the world who truly understood what each of them had experienced: the terror of dying, the confusion of returning, the strange half-life of being legally dead while very much alive. But that forced intimacy was dissolving now, replaced by the natural human desire to return to normal life, to pretend the impossible hadn't happened, to reclaim the futures that had been stolen. They were ready to move on. They needed to move on. Staying in limbo at Connor's farmhouse was sustainable as a temporary measure, but impossible as a permanent solution. Connor could feel it in the room. The restlessness, the eagerness to leave, the gratitude mixed with the desperate need for normalcy. He understood. He'd felt that same pull after his own traumatic resurrection 400 years ago, that desperate desire to pretend death hadn't touched him. Eleanor called the meeting to order with the same authority she'd used for 40 years of school assemblies. We need to talk about what happens next. We can't stay hidden forever. We need to return to our lives, face our families and friends, explain our survivals. And we need to decide how much we stay connected moving forward. The question hung in the air like smoke. They'd become a family, yes, but a family formed under duress. What would they be to each other in normal life, without death and resurrection binding them? Thomas spoke first, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. The PTSD was still there. Connor could see it in the way Thomas scanned the room constantly, checking exits, but Thomas was learning to manage it. I'm going back to my house tomorrow. My sister's flying in from California. I can't keep putting her off. I'll tell her Connor saved me, that I've been recovering privately. Nancy doesn't ask too many questions. She'll just be glad I'm alive. Margaret nodded, her expression peaceful in a way it hadn't been before death. Dying and returning had changed her, softened something that had been hard for too long. I've already called my daughter. She cried for 20 minutes straight. We haven't been close since her father died. I blamed her for not being there when Henry got sick, which wasn't fair. But this second chance, I'm not wasting it. I'm moving to Portland to be near Linda and my grandchildren. Fresh start. David leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than Connor had seen him since resurrection. The trauma had affected David less visibly than the others. Or perhaps David was just better at hiding it. Restaurant needs me. My staff has been holding it together, but they need the boss back. I'm telling everyone I was consulting for a restaurant group in New York when the fire happened. Came back to find everyone thought I was dead. Millbrook loves a comeback story. They'll buy it. Rebecca smiled, her faith evident in every word, stronger now than before death. If anything, dying and returning had reinforced her beliefs. I'm returning to my church. My congregation has been praying for my recovery. When I tell them God brought me back for a purpose, they'll believe me because it's true. My purpose is to witness to second chances and forgiveness, even for people like Ian Martin. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You're going to forgive the man who killed you? I'm going to try, Rebecca said simply. That's what my faith requires. Forgiveness doesn't mean he shouldn't face justice. He absolutely should. But forgiveness is for my peace, not his. I won't let Ian Martin steal my future by making me bitter. Harold, who'd been mostly silent throughout their time together, spoke quietly. I don't know if I can go back to normal. The nightmares, I still feel the knife sometimes. When I'm falling asleep, I wake up convinced I'm dying again. I think I need professional help. Real therapy, not just Connor playing counsellor. Connor nodded, feeling the guilt that had become familiar. Harold's trauma ran deepest, his resurrection most incomplete. I'll recommend someone. Dr. Sarah Michaels in Burlington. She's a trauma specialist who's very good. And Harold, there's no shame in needing help. What happened to you was brutal. Healing takes time, and it might take a lifetime. That's okay. Jennifer, who'd been taking notes throughout, still the efficient assistant even in this surreal circumstance, looked up with a smile that transformed her entire face. I'm staying in Millbrook, staying at the practice. Connor needs an assistant who knows the truth. And honestly, I need to be around someone who understands what happened. Marcus asked me to marry him yesterday. Said almost losing me made him realize he didn't want to wait another day. I said yes. The room erupted in congratulations. Eleanor hugged Jennifer with genuine warmth. Margaret cried happy tears. David immediately demanded to cater the wedding. Even Harold managed to smile. The first real one Connor had seen from him since resurrection. Connor watched this outpouring of affection and felt something complex bloom in his chest. Joy for Jennifer, sadness that the group was dispersing, pride in what they'd survived together, and guilt that his entertainment had led to their trauma in the first place. 400 years of life, and he was still learning how to feel appropriately. What about you, Connor? Eleanor asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. What happens next for the good doctor? Connor considered the question, really considered it, instead of deflecting with humour. I stay. For the first time in 50 years, I want to stay somewhere. Millbrook is home now. You're all part of that, even those of you leaving. I want to watch Jennifer get married, see if Margaret reconciles with her daughter, help Thomas start that PTSD support group he's been thinking about. I want to be present for lives instead of just preventing deaths. That's growth, Eleanor said with approval, her principal's voice tinged with genuine pride. I'm proud of you, Doctor. You're learning to be human. That's not easy for immortals. Are we going to stay in touch? Thomas asked, or is this goodbye? Eleanor had clearly thought about this already. I propose monthly dinners. Those of us still in Millbrook host, others attend when they can. We're bonded by something most people couldn't understand. We should honour that bond instead of trying to forget it. Everyone agreed, though Connor could see some hesitation. They wanted to move forward, wanted to forget the trauma. But Eleanor was right. They were bonded by impossible circumstances, and that bond deserved recognition. David volunteered his restaurant for the first dinner. They picked a date, first Saturday of every month, standing reservation, private room in the back where they could talk freely. The Survivors Club, David joked, then sobered. Actually, that's kind of perfect. We survived death itself. We're allowed to be proud of that. As the meeting wound down, Rebecca asked the question they'd all been thinking about but hadn't voiced. Connor, will you ever resurrect anyone else? If someone dies, will you bring them back? Connor was quiet for a long time, looking at the 9 people who died because he'd been bored, because he'd wanted entertainment, because he'd thought himself above consequence. 7 people who now carried trauma alongside their second lives. I don't know, he admitted finally. What I did for you 7, that was personal. You were my patients, my community, victims of a murderer I inadvertently enabled. But resurrection isn't something to be done lightly. Every one of you has trauma from dying. Harold is in crisis. Thomas has PTSD. Margaret lost months with her daughter. Jennifer's fiancé spent weeks grieving her. There are costs beyond death itself. But you do it again? Eleanor pressed. If someone you cared about died suddenly, you'd bring them back? Probably, Connor admitted, which might make me selfish or compassionate or playing God. I honestly don't know anymore. Life hasn't made me wise enough to answer that question. Good, Eleanor said firmly. If you ever become certain about the ethics of resurrection, you've become dangerous. The doubt keeps you human, or as human as a necromancer can be. The meeting broke up slowly. People lingered, not quite ready to leave the strange sanctuary they'd created together. Tomorrow, they would return to normal life. Or as normal as life could be after dying and coming back. But tonight, they were still the impossible 7, still bound by shared trauma and impossible survival. As Eleanor was leaving, the last to go, as always, she pulled Connor aside one final time. Thank you, not just for the resurrection, but for learning. When this started, you were playing a game with our lives. You finished it taking responsibility for your choices. That matters. Connor didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded, throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Eleanor, this fierce, wonderful woman who'd refused to let death or a necromancer intimidate her, patted his cheek like he was one of her former students who'd finally learned a difficult lesson, and walked out into her second life. Connor stood on his porch, watching cars pull away. 6 people returning to the world of the living. The night was cool and clear, stars visible in Millbrook's dark sky, and Connor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope for the future. Jennifer stayed behind, helping him clean up the coffee cups and cake plates from their gathering. The farmhouse felt larger, with just the 2 of them. The waste spaces always felt empty after being filled with life. "That went well," Jennifer said, loading the dishwasher with practiced efficiency. "All things considered." "All things considered," Connor agreed. "Thank you, Jennifer, for everything. For investigating when I was too arrogant to see the truth. For helping coordinate their care. For keeping my secret. For dying and coming back and still choosing to stay." Jennifer smiled, that warm smile that had made Connor hire her 3 years ago. "Where else would I go? I've seen impossible things, Connor. Normal jobs would be so boring after watching you resurrect 6 people, plus me, and catch a serial killer." Connor laughed. Genuine, warm laughter that surprised him with its ease. "Fair point, though I'm hoping the next few years are significantly less dramatic." "In Millbrook?" Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "With a necromancer practicing medicine? I doubt it," she said as she left. She was probably right, but for the first time in centuries, Connor was looking forward to finding out. The game was over. The entertainment had revealed its true cost. What came next wasn't boredom or distraction, but something harder and more rewarding. Actual life, with all its messy, complicated, beautiful imperfection. Connor closed the door and turned off the porch light, leaving the darkness outside where it belonged. Inside, there was light and warmth and the promise of tomorrow. For an immortal who'd spent 400 years running from attachment, that was more than enough.